So welcome. I'm Ed Osborne, Chair of the Visual Art Department. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our third Visiting Artist Lecture of the 24-25 school year. This one is our Spear Endowed Architecture Lecture. Tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce the truly multifaceted, multi-hyphenate, multi-talented Olalekan Jeyifous. He goes by Lake, and he's a visionary artist, designer, architect who creates worlds. Before we go any further, I'd like to begin with a living land acknowledgement. Brown University is built on what is now called College Hill, part of the unceded ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. Indigenous people from many nations, near and far, live, study, and work in Providence today. The amplification of Native voices and histories is crucial to rectifying the many violent legacies of colonialism, and we gratefully acknowledge the ongoing critical contributions of Indigenous people within this university and across our state, region, and nation. In addition, I would like to acknowledge that we are connected by a campus that relied on the African slave trade in the Americas, and that there are buildings on campus constructed by enslaved people. We recognize that land acknowledgements are not a replacement for the necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land we are speaking from today. These acknowledgements and much more commit us to a lifetime of decolonial and anti-racist work. And now, I'd like to thank Heather Mandari, who unfortunately couldn't be with us this evening, Winnie Geyer, CJ Liu, and Media Services for facilitating this evening's event. A few more things to note. First, please don't record this event. We value and respect the IP of our visiting artists, and we'll post a recording on our YouTube account with their permission. Still shots are great. Just please tag @Brown Visual Art and @KidCadaver. Second, after Lake's presentation, there'll be a Q&A. There are 2 microphones in the aisles already set up there, so just come on up to the mic, and if you have a question, it's expected that everyone be kind, curious, and respectful in their questions, and please just 1 question per person. And now, for our esteemed guest, Lake Jeyifous received a bachelor's in architecture from Cornell University and currently lives in Brooklyn, New York. His work reimagines social spaces that examine the relationships between architecture, community, and the environment. He has exhibited at esteemed venues including the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Vitra Design Museum, and the Museum of Modern Art, where his artwork is featured in the permanent collection of the Department of Architecture and Design. Recently, Lake was co-commissioned to design a monument for Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm as part of the New York's Built NYC initiative, and has garnered numerous awards, including the notable Silver Lion at the 2023 Venice Architectural Biennale. Additionally, he's a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow, a recipient of the 2021 Fellowship by the United States Artists, and has been a Wilder Green Fellow at the MacDowell Colony. He's completed artist residencies at the Bellagio Center and supported by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Drawing Center's Open Session Program. He's been in countless group exhibitions and solo shows, and his recent exhibition, even in Arcadia at Art Omi this spring, was truly amazing. So please welcome me in joining Olalekan Jeyifous to Brown University.
All right. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's truly exciting. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm gonna dive right in. I've been calling this lecture, "The Road Became a River, Possibilities and Parallels." So I'm going to take you through kind of the, trajectory of my architectural practice. The Road Became a River has been significant for me. It's actually the reversal of this quote by Nigerian author, playwright, Ben Okri, and it goes, "In the beginning there was a river, the river became a road, and the road branched out to the whole world. And because the road was once a river, it was always hungry." I love The Famished Road, the novel from which this is from, but this quote particularly has always been, I think, kind of connected to my work, and in terms of the narrative that it reflects in the novel is one about kind of like rapid industrialization and all the reverberations that kind of come out of that. And in a lot of my own sort of practice and work, I feel like I do the reverse in a sense, which is why I flipped the quote on its end in saying the road became the river, both a kind of rewilding of the built environment and the consideration of architectural form design less as, these sort of permanent buildings and structures that sort of aggrandize the individual, but more about its relationship to community and kind of more holistic relationship. So I always like to begin with, my artistic practice is kind of shaped from my architectural education at Cornell University. And I always like to go all the way back to that, particularly because as a member of Gen X, my education straddled the digital divide almost directly dead center. And I feel that really has shaped my approach to art making and architecturally inspired art making, a kind of balance of both analog traditions of architectural representation and then a fascination with digital computer software, their relevant potential for design. So the first 2.5 years were drawing, model making, etc. And in the last half of the 5-year education, I kind of spent more of a focus on playing around with computer software. And at that time, 1995 to 2000, it was sort of unprecedented, right? It was very, very new. Software's relationship to the field of architecture and design. And so I like to start with my thesis because it embodies both that digital as well as analog kind of interweaving, but also my approach to a lot of my world building practices and the kind of conceptual frameworks that I set up and give myself to produce these sort of worlds and these narratives. And so my thesis in 2000 was Abiku phenomenon. And so the Abiku, just to give you a brief background, Abiku is a kind of very important Yoruba belief in Nigeria, and it pertains to when a family may lose 2 or 3 or more children at a very early age. That's what the belief attends to. It's believed that the child that they are losing, for whatever reason, disease, getting hit by a car, whatever, it's believed that they're inhabited by not an ancestral spirit, but a childlike spirit known as Yabiku. Because in Yoruba culture, it's the sort of belief is very cyclical. You were born, you live, you have a family, children, you die, you return to the ancestral spirit world, and you continue that cycle over and over again. So all of us who are here, we've been here before many times. But the Abiku disrupts that belief. It's believed that these are child spirits who make a pact with the other Abiku children to return to the spirit world as soon as possible. And so what does that have to do with my thesis? And I'm always interested because there's no way to really shorten this. And so the Abiku phenomenon is actually a contemporary intentional misappropriation of that belief applied to sort of a social political situation. You know, Nigeria gained independence in 1960, and there was sort of multiple military coups as trying to establish itself as an independent nation state. And the Abiku phenomenon is seen as a kind of sudden but potentially promising outlook on the future of the country. So it's taking this very tragic belief and flipping it and having this sort of like potentially positive outcome for it. So I use that in my thesis as a way of kind of playing around with form making, but also this narrative of intentionally misreading a kind of traditional belief for, a sort of more social-political application. And so what I did was I built a 3D model of a king's palace, Oba's palace. I found like plans and photographs, and I used this program called Form Z, which is a very, very early CAD program, and it has this rendering function called Quick Paint. which is incredibly useless and pointless because quick paint does not calculate along the x-axis. So if you've built a house and you've built up the model and you hit the quick paint render, it may throw fragments of the back porch in front of the building, and just it completely distorts your model and what you're trying to create. And for me, that was incredibly fascinating because architecture and this software is all about legibility. But for me, I was so much more fascinated with this as a kind of narrative tool and less about reading the model or making it clear. And so I just, did a series of these renderings and just would stop the rendering at different intervals. So I just set up a set of rules for myself to create these fragments and then projected them back into plan. And so that's the kind of overlaying of these printouts, using yellow trace and then figuring out how to project these perspectives back in the plan, and then created a series of new renderings from that. But it's much more about kind of this process, and again, that blend of the analog and misusing these tools as a kind of way of just developing conceptual narratives. So I decided to be an artist because I felt, graduating from a program like Cornell, which was incredibly a conceptual program, I just really fell in love with the idea of being able to see the ideas, a sense of immediacy, be able to see my ideas and thoughts and get them out into the world. And so I sort of pivoted into a kind of art practice. But not coming out of an MFA program, I spent, some time figuring out what my art would look like, right? And even trying to gain a sense of confidence about this is art, right? Because I'm not necessarily a painter, a sculptor, or what have you. Architectural drafting. So one of my early exhibits, I'm actually skipping over a huge portion to 2016, to one of my first solo exhibits with this gallery in London called 50 Goldburn. And again, I, was looking at another Nigerian author, Ni Osundare, and his poem, Not My Business. And just like with the famished Rhode, it has its own, kind of idea, but I was sort of more fascinated with it as looking at my relationship to Nigeria as someone who was born there, left when I was 6. My mom is American, so grew up with her throughout various cities in the States, and, hadn't been back to visit in a very long time, and definitely not at this time. And so my relationship to home, Nigeria, through a series of these sort of architectural follies that were conceived through a blend of kind of photographs that my mom had taken when we were children and living in Nigeria, in Ile-Ife, news clippings, and just what I remember about the place. And so these are black cardstock on watercolor paper, and then these sort of wooden sculptures or architectural maquettes, depending on what sort of art or architecture venue I'm located in. And they have names like Fear God, Redux, so there's a lot of kind of intense traffic, particularly in Lagos. And so you see these kind of tuk-tuks, which you see throughout the continent in Southeast Asia, et cetera. And they often have sort of religious scripture printed on the side because it's the precarity of navigating that traffic. Play Juju sort of references my childhood of listening to high life in our home. Music was central. And then just, again, these sort of collages, strike worker, just me remembering there was always a strike. One way, the Okadas, which are again, these sort of motorcycles, form of 1, 2, 3-person public transportation. Onions are my husband, reflect the kind of relationship of market women to the role of gaining independence for, various countries throughout West Africa, the importance of the role of market women. I think it's actually a title of a book by a Ghanaian woman that references specifically that role that market women played in independence. Nayude Drive. So again, a lot of these just, based kind of on my memories, using, the sort of isometric, axonometric drawing as a way of just being kind of very bold and visual about how I'm thinking through these things. Overpriced Golder reminds me of the bars that the expats would drink at. There's usually like a pool nearby. It's just, kind of like a fascinating way of working through these memories. And of course, Mobile Marketplace features central. And so, again, using kind of my sort of personal background to connect with the fact that I had not been back to Nigeria in so many years, figured a lot in sort of my early work. That led to a project called Shanty Megastructures for Lagos in 2015, but I've been working on this for a while. I'm also very heavily inspired by science fiction. Particularly, science fiction, I think, does something very interesting in that it takes kind of contemporary anxieties and projects them either into near or far-flung futures, and then either exacerbates them into these dystopias as a way of highlighting, the issues we have now. Or it resolves them into these sort of tenuous utopias where you realize it's being held together by something preposterous, like you're unable to experience emotions, or you all have to wear the same thing, or people are euthanized at like 20. So I'm always excited by the idea of science fiction as like a way of, reflecting discourse around contemporary issues. So for Shanty Megastructures for Lagos, Nigeria, I was fascinated by the idea of massive real estate development that takes place throughout the world, and how on the best of days, it ignores more marginalized communities, but on the worst of days, it completely destroys and displaces them and views them as eyesores. And of course, this isn't specific to Lagos. You see it all over the US. But so the picture of a large-scale development, and then not far is the improvised housing settlement, Makoko Fishing Village. And so what I wanted to do was create this massive development at the scale of what would normally be like these luxury office towers or luxury residential towers, but place it over the third mainland bridge, which is this bridge that connects Lagos Island to the mainland, and it's known for its nightmarish traffic. So I created the idea of this sort of large organic structure that would sit somewhere in the middle of that bridge and make it not just a kind of connection, but a destination in and of itself. And this was kind of like an early skyscraper project I've been playing around with, but it was exhibited at the Shenzhen Biennial in 2015, and it became much more about these just like really massive visuals that took, this sort of building typology, material language of these informal settlements and scaled it up to these massive buildings. And then through these photo montages, I kind of placed them in areas of what would be privileged real estate throughout Lagos, Nigeria, as a way of like, establishing visibility and prominence to these communities that are often overlooked, intentionally disenfranchised, or outright destroyed. but also kind of challenging the idea of what sci-fi looks like outside of a particularly Western context, and the idea of what technological advancement may mean, and that has become kind of a theme throughout a lot of my work, particularly imagining a kind of more organic connection between the sort of built environment, advanced technology, and communities. And at the time when I was creating this, I didn't really know that it was called solar punk. So I gave a talk at, I think, UC Riverside in 2015, where I got introduced to the term, and I was like, oh, yeah, that's definitely what I'm doing. So I now, discuss my work in that way. Along with these massive images, I created an animation where I actually took what would be the antithesis of my shanty megastructures, which is a real development in Lagos called Echo Atlantic, which is exactly the kind of massive, urban scaled, commercial luxury development that causes a lot of environmental problems, in addition to a lot of human problems, right? So what I did was I found a lot of their promotional videos online through YouTube. I downloaded them, and then anywhere they had like B-roll, just like 3 seconds, I chopped that out, and then I CGI'd my shanty megastructures into those scenes and put together my own promotional video, uploaded it with the same SEO language and keywords so that when people would search for Echo Atlantic, they'd see shanty megastructures. So it was kind of like my earliest forays into guerrilla art. This continued with an exhibit called African Mobilities, which was curated by Mpo Matsipa, and she, a brilliant South African woman, and she was like, we need to take shanty megastructures and this weird, improbable project you've created and bring it to the continent. It's not enough to simply just show this work in the West and, we take our trips over there, but there's never any true exchange. You're never engaging with, the places where this work is being imagined. And so she wanted me to collaborate with someone. So I collaborated with this amazing writer, Wale Lawal. You can see him on the lower right there. We're on a boat in the middle of Makoko. And we created a series of animations, but we also held workshops. And then we had a screening under Falomo Roundabout. And this is the bridge. One of the earlier renderings, you saw the kind of area with the bridge. This is under that bridge. So we held a kind of very open, public screening of these 3 animations that we created built off of my world, as well as VR to really give you a sense of this massive scale. We wanted people to be inside of it. I also gave a lecture at UNILAG, University of Lagos Architecture School, showing the work, and I got eviscerated. So after I presented the work, a student raised her hand, and she was literally so incensed that she was in tears. And she was like, why are you creating ruin porn for the consumption of the West? Why are you, showing these ramshackle, crumbling large visions and saying this is what we're doing in Africa? And after she made that statement, the entire room erupted into like a 4-minute standing ovation. So I was like, ooh, okay, here we go. But another student stood up and kind of saved me and was like, I actually don't think it's negative. We need to interrogate why you believe that it looks bad to me. It uses local materials. It adapts and grows organically as the need presents itself. So maybe we should think about, why this seems bad. And then you got like some claps, but it created a spirited debate. And it's been central at kind of my work, thinking, is it dystopia? Is it utopia? What have you? But following that project, I was much more interested about getting into kind of the interiority, imagining how the inhabitants might occupy this space, and got introduced to another term, another sci-fi subgenre called salvage punk, which is just the use of kind of available material, the sort of excesses of capital detritus, sort of remaking these new advanced technologies from old radios, e-waste, and what have you. A similar extension of solar punk. It's much more about, technology that relies on systems that we already have, but reimagining them. And that's been core to how I think through this as well. And so these are photographs that either I've taken or friends of mine have taken, or some of them have been sourced from the web, but outfitting like a truck and turning it into a sort of this mobile green garden produce delivery hovercraft, woman and child with the air infiltration system. And so I refer to this series as the Anarchonaut series. And so that's a portmanteau between astronauts and anarchy, because this is both like a very kind of, again, informal settlements sort of survive these larger structures as they crumble, precisely because they rely on exchange and community, mutual aid, and what have you. So you have the woman on the Okada / pod racer. We have the kid who walks around with the sort of Wi-Fi antenna, creating sort of cell and Wi-Fi hotspots for folks. This is a photograph that I actually took in Makoko of a double height fishing house, and added it onto this sort of amphibious trawler with these aeroponic gardens. And so the display of this work, I just printed up stickers and would slap them up all around Brooklyn. So again, that very like blend of lo-fi, but when I did show these large, they're really just very quickly, taking these photographs, a little bit of 3D modeling and SketchUp, and then just mixing them together, and then I would print them out on 8.5 by 11 sheets and tape them together to create like the large prints, or as these kind of stickers that I would stick up all around my neighborhood in Crown Heights. So I'm gonna pivot for a second into just a couple public art projects. So public art has allowed me to live as an artist, pay rent, healthcare, and all of those things. And so I'm like the proselytizer of public art for visual artists as an alternative to the gallery world, because it's like you get 20% of whatever that budget is. So budgets are like 100,000 to $1 million, 2 million, whatever. You do a few of those a year, you kind of end up making a living wage. And also public art for me was a way to kind of reconcile my architectural background in terms of built one-to-one scale works, and also engaging with budget, client, community, stakeholders, neighborhoods is a kind of really interesting exercise in that way. So this is the Boom and the Bust. It was part of the Art Prize, Grand Rapids, Michigan, one of the oldest public art venues in the US. And it was in Grand Rapids, and I was looking at this sort of history of redlining, and the Boom and the Bust refers to these sort of dual narratives. One, that there's economic boom, there's a lot of building going on, but then the bust when you account along racial lines of what's happening and access to affordable housing, and issues of homelessness or semi-homelessness, people living out of hotels and cars. There were sort of these two narratives occurring, where on the one hand it may seem like things are going well, but on the other hand, so many houses were being bought up by foreign investors outside of the state, outside of the country, which drove up prices, or they were just hoarding affordable houses. So there really was a kind of crisis in that regard. My site was downtown, directly across from their Contemporary Art Museum, and it was a very sort of small footprint. So I created a more vertical design. And so these are just early SketchUp renderings of what I wanted to do. I ended up going with the one on the right, and just the idea of large scale, again, commercial development occurring downtown, where there was a lot of at the time, using the sort of raw, unfinished language of construction, exposed steel beams, but then that being bisected by these small red homes, little monopoly homes, which red often indicates a kind of negative statistic. So I wanted to show the sort of kind of tension between the two. And so it's 25 feet tall with an 8 by 8 foot footprint. And again, for me, the kind, when neighborhoods are transforming, it's less, it's more ominous when you see the construction sheds and the scaffolding going up, and they'll be up there for many years. You know things are sort of percolating and happening. So I wanted to use that kind of very rough, again, material language with that. And so it was located downtown. There was a lot of, development going on by there. But again, you can see the relationship between that sort of massive brutalist shape. And again, if you remember the sort of the architectural follies from my solo exhibit, I kind of like this very simple isometric distill-like language. A recent project that I completed in Spartansburg, South Carolina, was called Regeneration, and it was in a North Side neighborhood. And one of the things I love about public art is the opportunity I get to travel around to different cities throughout the U.S. and really connect with communities there and learn a bit about the history, their values, maybe some of the local flora and fauna, the things they find important, but really engaging with community members who are interested in having sort of artwork that commemorates this neighborhood. And so, again, there's a lot of development occurring in the North Side neighborhood of Spartansburg, but there was an emphasis on not gentrifying the community and having, any new development had to be offset by something, specifically for the community. So they had built sports centers and, again, kind of more affordable housing and different job opportunities. But my design was for kind of, again, a sort of entryway into the neighborhood. So it was in the plaza connected to one of the new housing buildings. And, just building with the community members, hearing about the plans that they had, particularly around education, housing, job security, and kind of food and health. I created these sort of 4 interlocking circles. And the community was sort of heavily, I guess the unofficial mascot there was a monarch butterfly, and then I think the eastern swallow, is that a bird or, eastern striped tiger butterfly or something was either the state animal, but they really kind of liked the butterfly idea. So creating these 4 interlocking spheres, and then wanted to create a space for sort of gathering and commemoration. And so, again, these 4 zones, these benches, and then these posts, these masts that reflect, the values of the community. And it's known as the North Side neighborhood, so there's sort of large astrolabe or astrolabe at the top, kind of pointing north. And again, I really enjoy these projects. They get me out of I'm very much a sort of introverted hobbit in my little hidey hole, toiling away. So public art is a very public practice. There's so many meetings, again, with community members, various stakeholders, fabricators, engineers. So it really kind of brings me out of my head into a kind of more one-to-one space. And so you can see a little bit more of the details in the aerial there. And these borders, again, reflect these different aspects. It's made out of ipe wood, so it's fairly durable. And yeah, this is probably one of the larger projects that I'd done that had, a seating element as well as a kind of visual engagement element. And so, returning back to that world building, I was having done the shanty megastructures for Lagos, and at the time, I'd been in Brooklyn. Well, I've now been in Brooklyn and Crown Heights neighborhood since 2000. So yeah, 24 years, almost 25 years now, seeing that neighborhood change enormously. I wanted to bring some of the ideas and concepts of the shanty megastructures to Brooklyn. And so I was part of this exhibit at the MoMA in 2021 called Reconstruction's Blackness in America, where 12 Black artists, architects were invited to reimagine Reconstruction in the city sort of their choosing. And I call this next round of my lecture the Protopian Parallel, because at this point, as you see, I'm taking terms like salvage punk, solar punk, and what they mean, and dystopia and utopia. Now protopia, I think, reflects more of a kind of iterative, generative understanding of building sort of new world spaces is outside of the binary of negative or positive or bad, but something that's ongoing and evolving and that we figure out. But also they connect in that they're both no longer futuristic works. So I'm not, there's a lot of excitement around Afrofuturism, but I've been more and more fascinated with the idea of alternate pasts that could have occurred under a set of different conditions as opposed to reimagining the future. As well as just the idea of, back to the concept of salvage punk, we have so many of the technology we need right now to battle a lot of issues, climate issues, environmental issues, and forward-thinking futurisms often operate under a kind of a financial impetus or a controlled obsolescence and less about community and coalition building. And so I've been more interested in like the past and alternate pasts. So these two projects, the Frozen Neighborhoods / Proto-Farm Communities of Upstate New York, was exhibited at the MoMA, and the ACEAP, African Conservation Effort in All Africa Protoport, was exhibited at the Venice Architecture Biennale. So I was fascinated by this sort of eco-futurist Brooklyn. And so the Frozen Neighborhoods imagines this really restrictive government policy that was enacted in the 70s, where a mobility credit system was established, and that would determine how frequently, how far, and how many people could travel, basically limiting any sort of transportation of any kind to limit, greenhouse gas emissions. And this was a collaboration with a good friend of mine who I went to Cornell with as well, Matty Vaz. And we sort of developed this idea. Matty adds that critical rigor. I'm like, this is what I want to do. Help me set it up. So came up with the mobility credit system, put it on kind of the free market so more affluent individuals could buy up mobility credits. Poorer communities could sell mobility credits in order to gain capital. And so in this world, that's what they've done. And by 1995, Brooklyn is almost a sort of isolated community space that has created these new technologies, given that there's, limited opportunity to really move beyond Brooklyn. So I imagine what that looks like. And so I always kind of show, this is an aerial. This is actually when I had a brief architectural firm. It was in that building on Grand and Flushing in Brooklyn. But my friend still runs it. So he sent up his drone. And then I kind of, again, created this really dense, hyper vivid photo montage from that. And almost all of the renderings that I create for the work I do are from photographs that I've actually taken around the neighborhood, or just photographs that have from elsewhere that I've pieced together. The pandemic sort of truncated the scope and scale of this exhibit, so I was granted this wonderful floating wall here and had both sides of it. So I created a series of renderings, these kind of abstracted models, and then a sort of full-scale subway map or MTA map model, which was created from kind of taking a commercial mailbox that I actually purchased from the U.S. Postal Service and built in my living room. And just a way of kind of really breaking down this entire project, because these things are really very dense. So I'm trying to figure out what to show and how to bring people through it. And so it included a 3-channel, 7-minute fly-through. Part of my interest as well with reimagining Brooklyn is looking at gentrification in the way my neighborhood, Crown Heights, has changed over these 25 years, and kind of preserving that language, that urban ephemera, vanishing urban ephemera of the storefront, bodega, delis, church storefronts, which, you know, kind of get a facelift as the neighborhood changes. And so the largest image was of this bodega, which is just right up the street from me, that I took a picture of and replaced it with all of the information about this project, the technology, the breakdown of flooded neighborhoods, of the MTA system, how it works now, the different places you can get food, you can get, you know, fresh water delivery. And again, just using that language of like posters and handmade maps and handmade advertisements and just kind of switching them out and adding in a way to articulate this world through this sort of key legend that has that aesthetic. And so I created these, you know, again, series of very detailed and dense images. Plant seeds, grow blessings, Brooklyn Interfaith Seed Vault. So I imagined that all of the various religious communities came together and were responsible for both the preservation and the generation of kind of new seeds and seed types and dispersing them throughout the community. And then the Franklin Avenue Shuttle Gateway Triple Stack. The MTA in this world is from the Metropolitan Transit Authority to the main threshold access. So I created these scenes where subway cars, they no longer move you from one place to the other, but they act as these sort of immersive kiosks where you can do everything from, you know, learning to religious services to connecting with family throughout the larger world and the diaspora. So this is what the inside of a kind of subway car looks like in this world. And renaming all of the various lines, the ACE, the 1, 2, 3, you know, the QR for the services they provide instead in this world. And so an extension of this project, so similarly with the, you know, shanty megastructures evolving into arcanauts, so much of my work, they're just never ending, you know, unless I'm moving on to something else. I imagine them as these evolving worlds that I've only scratched the surface of. So I continue to grow and develop them. So extending out of this, I created the idea of these fugitive silvo-agricultural sites. So Brooklyn would be connecting with these proto-farm communities of upstate New York. And in reimagining that, I kind of took both the canal system and the railway system and sort of revitalized them in this world. And now they become almost a kind of underground railroad that connects these various sites. Because there is a whole other narrative to this world about, you know, these are really fugitive spaces. And so this is what these kind of neighborhoods look like, or these areas and these sort of, this kind of hovering greenhouse tractor farm. And then this sort of drone, it's both seeding and watering, you know, these forest spaces. These poultry farms, and also, again, thinking through, technological advancement in science fiction, I've always been fascinated by the idea that we learn in school that civilization was determined by moving from hunter-gatherer to these agrarian societies of clearing land and creating farm spaces. And that reflected so much this very Western idea of dominion over nature, of being able to clear land and build on it and do this, as opposed to a more holistic relationship with it. So I was fascinated by that New York State is some 67% covered in sort of forest land, and so thinking of bioforestry as a kind of long-standing indigenous technology that works with the ecology of a particular space. And these forest farm spaces persist for thousands of years, where the farmlands, agrarian societies do not. And so again, that idea of futuristic or advancement. And I created this massive, you can't get a sense of scale from it, but this is like a large 8-foot in diameter psychogeographic map that reflects, similar to the bodega image, this is a kind of key legend for this now extension of the frozen neighborhoods mobility credit system into the pro-farm communities. It's a planting cycle, reflects the different technologies, as well as both that map for the canal system and the train system. Is that time? Should we go to Q&A? Yes. All right, we'll stop there. Thank you.
Have you ever thought of, hi, thanks for coming, by the way. Have you ever thought of doing a sort of documentary narrative video about the worlds you're creating that are mostly in your head?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I actually do create a documentary narrative I didn't get to the, this one has a 13-minute video essay documentary that articulates the world space and how it operates. So I do like that idea of a fictionalized way of presenting the rules, in documentary form. So it's like less didactic as me explaining it here, but you get a sense of it. Video features heavily in these works. I always have some animated component or some video essay, or it's just some experimental, some experimental video accompaniment to these projects. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. I was really intrigued by the statement the question that you asked yourself. You are always asking for your dystopian or utopian. And I'm wondering if you have proposed or thought of proposing a third option.
Yeah, absolutely. So that third option is the protopian world. I think that attends to the fact that we're never arriving at that space of utopia, and we have met dystopia in a certain world, in certain senses, and throughout time and history. But in rebuilding, it's always a process, and so protopia really reflects that. It's messy, and some things work and some things don't work, right? But part of the sort of arc of moving forward is figuring that aspect out. And even with projects like this and the one before, when I do these narratives, there are like insidious and seedy underbellies, right? And there are people who disagree with this world, disagree with the decision to be closed off and create, this frozen neighborhoods, Brooklyn, as opposed to fighting, this mobility system. So I always try and present that this may not even be the right, world or the right direction.
Do you think there's a possibility, as someone, you actually helping communities were founded, can you envision a possibility of real life communities, utopian communities?
Yeah, no, the interesting thing about when I show these works are that there are people who really want to see it come to fruition, right? And they reach out, and I get people who I was invited to give a talk for this German think tank, and they had director of housing for sub-Saharan Africa and the MIT robotics engineer that does the waste systems for this place, and then me, and I was like, what am I doing here? But precisely because they felt, world making and reimagining the world kind of should have an interdisciplinary relationship with people who are actually connected to realizing these things, So when I give these talks, there's always some, there's, in addition to someone who runs a community garden or some other network, and they want to, have, more practical conversations about how we realize some of these aspects and reproduce it in the real world. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for being here. I was really struck by your land acknowledgement and how contextually informed it was. Could you talk more about your positionality and how that's informed your work, specifically coming from Cornell, and just how that's informed the sense of liminality of being a mediator between stakeholders and, things among that?
Okay. Do you mean the land acknowledgement that Ed made, or?
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know it was but is that a part of your thought process? Because I know you mentioned concepts of indigeneity. So.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question that is sort of, I feel like it's hairy, because on the one hand, I was just kind of thrown off by the land acknowledgement because, as well, you articulated yourself, it's a thing, but it's not quite enough, but it does at least acknowledge a commitment to, sort of material response, not simply just saying, the idea of a land acknowledgement. But that's a very great question, because it really does tie into how I think about particularly these public art projects. An example is that I'm often invited to create public art for displaced communities, right? And I feel I've done those projects, but I have begun to feel a little bit weird about it, being hired as the Black artist to commemorate a displaced Black community, and sometimes the commissioning agent may actually be responsible for that. You know what I mean? So it's a very weird space to be in, which is why I have such a, kind of interesting relationship to the idea of land acknowledgement. There's even that joke where, someone gives you an eviction notice, but they begin the eviction notice with the land acknowledgement. So there's a weird neoliberal kind of performative aspect, but, it again, is something that I think it's important to consider, as I evolve through my work and think both about the public art that I do and my reimagining and even getting eviscerated by the, Lego students for this work that they felt drew on a kind of ruin porn and poor communities to make this grand statement, but it's featured in Domus magazine or something. You know what I mean? It is something that I think very hard about, and that I make part of kind of my practice of considering how to move forward, how to engage, and how to interact with various communities. I do like to always make it clear that I do not run a social practice, you know what I mean? I'm far too introverted to go and do that kind of building, but I do try and connect in other ways. But that is very much, for me, an important and ongoing kind of consideration in my work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mhm. Anyone else? Oh, then we got one, yes.
Hi, I thought your talk was really great. I thought it was really interesting the way you weaved like narrative into like your like artistic practice, and I was wondering like what different like forms of media have like inspired, particularly like your like sci-fi like narrative, especially in your like Brooklyn like project.
Yeah, no, I'm inspired by visuals, film, architectural drawings. I read a lot, so reading is, I've been very inspired by, obviously, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, which is, has had a massive resurgence because of how spot on it was about what 2024 is going to look like. But China Miéville's Perdido Street Station, which introduced me to a kind of salvage punk, steampunkish kind of look. So that very ad hoc aesthetic, was inspired by that. But particularly his book, The City in the City, which is very like subtle sci-fi, but imagines these two cities that occupy the same exact geographic space. They exist in the same exact space. So literally this lecture hall would have two cities in it, and the inhabitants of these different cities, you may be sitting next to each other, what have you, but you are not allowed to talk to each other because you're not in the same city, and there's a very strict structure and a bureaucratic process you must go through to enter into the other city. And there's small signifiers like dress and language and the way you walk and the way you move that this narrative, this story really goes through. And it inspired me a lot because that is how I have seen my neighborhood, Crown Heights, being gentrified, is it really feels like a city in the city. So they're like long-standing community members who literally only go into this bodega, and no newer resident gentrifier goes into that neighborhood. And they walk, up and down the same street, and there's not a lot of interaction. And there's literally like neighborhood bar, gentrified bar, bodega, grocery store, you know what I mean? Literally on the same block. So, so you can see that kind of dichotomy reflected in, even my public art with the boom and the bust. And, of course, with the frozen neighborhoods, again, this kind of like tension and multiple overlapping narratives. So yeah, that's been a kind of big influence in how I think about creating these spaces and these worlds. Hope that answers your question. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes.